political imagination reflects this basic understanding of the imagination's capacity to represent things that are not necessarily there. So when we're thinking about how to translate it into politics, it has these two political implications of either creating new things in the world or supporting certain institutions that maintain the world as it is now. The basic idea here is that in order to change the world, we have to be able to imagine that the world can be other than it is right now.
Welcome to the Civic Agora, a podcast from the Stanford Civics Initiative, where we discuss ideas on democracy and citizenship.
Everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Civic Agora. I'm your host, Javier Mejia. And today I have the great pleasure of being with Avshalom Schwartz. Avshalom is a postdoctoral fellow here at the Stanford Civics Initiative. He's a brilliant political theorist. I'm very excited of having him here with us. We're going to be talking about the role of imagination and misinformation and collective action and democracy. Avshalom, how are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. It is our pleasure. And as usual, I would like to start our conversation by knowing more about you. I know you grew up in Israel, and I don't know very well the details of how you ended up being interested in political theory, in ancient political theory. I don't know how you learned ancient Greek. Tell me about that. What's the path that made you the type of scholar that you are today, and how you ended up here at Stanford thinking about Aristotle?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I grew up in Israel, and I got my bachelor's and my master's in Tel Aviv University. And when I just started my bachelor's, I was, I think my main goal, my main motivation was to grow up and make a lot of money. Clearly, I chose a weird career path for this kind of goal. But what happened is that I enrolled in an econ major. I started as an econ major, and then I had to choose a double major because that's how it's normally done in the Israeli system. And what I did was kind of randomly choosing political science. The title looked interesting. But the first class of the first semester was Intro to Political Theory, and we've read Plato. I guess I am yet another youth that was corrupted by Socrates because I just fell in love with political theory, with the history of political thought. And while I ended up completing my bachelor's in economics, my real passion became political science and especially political theory. And so I took a bunch more classes, and I ended up getting a master's in political theory, but I was focusing more on contemporary critical theory. And when I decided to pursue my PhD in political science and political theory, I was contemplating several different directions, and one of them was going back to sort of the thing that originally got me excited about political theory, which is ancient Greek political thought. And that's how I ended up in Stanford working with the great Josiah Ober. And so the only problem was that when I got into Stanford, I didn't know a word in ancient Greek. That's not something that I had in my background. So one of the biggest hurdles that I had to overcome when I decided that this is what's going to be the main thing I'm going to study was to pick up ancient Greek. And I was very lucky that Berkeley, not too far here from Stanford, has an excellent intensive summer workshop in ancient Greek. And during my second year of the PhD, I took 10 weeks of intensive ancient Greek classes. It was probably the best and the worst time of my life. It was incredibly difficult and time consuming, but I ended up that's how I started picking up ancient Greek and being able to pursue more seriously the study of ancient Greek political thought.
And do you remember what exactly was the thing in theater that excited you? It's so weird to me, right? But tell me about it. What did you feel that grabbed you so strongly?
It's a great question, and I'm not sure. I have to say that I haven't reflected enough on it from a retrospectively. But I think that I haven't been exposed to too much philosophy growing up, and I haven't read too much the history of political thought in high school or before coming to the university. And so there was something about this approach to questions of political life that I never quite encountered, and I was very excited about. It seemed to me like such a different way than how our normal political discourse operates. it seemed to really dive so deeply into deep foundational questions about the nature of politics, political life, our commitment to justice and to other political values. So I think it struck me as so profoundly strange and different than how we normally do things, and got me really, really curious and learning more.
That's very interesting. I mean, I'm super interested in general about what most students, right? What really makes them interested in something. Okay, I'm going to ask you more about that. I know you're working on the translation of Plato to Hebrew. So even knowing now that you learned ancient Greek as an adult, it amazed me even more of that endeavor. I'm going to ask you more about that. But before that, I would like to ask you about your research agenda. And you're a super prolific scholar, but most of your work recently is on imagination, right? So I want to know more about that, and probably a good way to start that conversation would be to hear from you. What do you understand by imagination?
So my approach to the imagination is very historical. I originally became interested in the imagination from a contemporary angle. I was quite frustrated with what seemed to me as our inability and capacity to imagine alternative ways of life to our current way of life and some of our current problems. But I ended up investigating this question of imagination and political imagination from a different angle, from a historical angle. And what historical authors usually understood by imagination is something that is deeply tied to our epistemological capacities and to how we view and understand the world. And so for scholars since antiquity and basically all the way until the 18th century, the imagination was tied to sensation. And it was able to produce, the imagination is the faculty that allows us to produce mental representations of the things that we perceived by our senses. But I think that from the way I think today about the political imagination is that it's still, in very important ways, it reflects this basic understanding of the imagination's capacity to represent things that are not necessarily there. So when we're thinking about how to translate it into politics, I think there are two main ways in which it does it. And I think it corresponds to key roles that the imagination has in politics. One of them is our ability to represent things that haven't happened yet, or to represent the world in a way that it could be, that is other than it is right now, which means that the imagination becomes a crucial factor in our ability to motivate our individual action, but also our collective action. So the basic idea here is that in order to change the world, we have to be able to imagine that the world can be other than it is right now. But I think that the fact that the imagination allows us to represent things in their absence is also crucial for so many of the institutions that structure our life, our collective life, that depends on very abstract ideas that do not necessarily have a corresponding things in reality. And so I think one of the paradigmatic examples from the literature is Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities. And this is the notion that the nation state, this modern construct of the nation state, is impossible without our ability to imagine ourselves as sharing something something quite deep with people that we've never met and we never will meet. And this thing relies on our imagination. So many of our collective institutions end up relying on the imagination. And so I think that that's how I currently understand the imagination, is something that corresponds to our ability to represent things in their absence. And it has these two political implications of either creating new things in the world or supporting certain institutions that maintain the world as it is now.
Let me ask you something about that, in the sense that, so there are two things that I sort of understand your view of imagination. Like, one is this like collective set of narratives that are like focal points that make sense to our understanding of the world. And I feel sort of comfortable with like those type of concepts like that. I can connect that with some of the conventional mainstream ideas in political science. The other one seems much more novel and obscure to me because I've never systematically thought about this like seriously. And there's this idea of absence, right? And it's fascinating, but I'm struggling to think about the constraints of that element, in the sense that the absence can be anything, right? So I guess I'm something's coming to my mind. So every course I ask my students to do a research project by the end of the course, and usually students, I'm sure you're very much aware of this, they start working on the final project the week before the deadline, right? So I push them to avoid that, delivering an assignment early in the quarter in which they have to record a video that is a sort of pitch of a fictional nature in which they are selling the idea of this research project to donors or investors or so on. Of course, like, again, it has a practical purpose, so they start working on the thing early on, but also I expect that they develop this capacity to be persuasive, and they manage to argue that what they're doing is going to be valuable, even if they haven't done that, and right? So it is a fictional setting, right? So one of the things that I also want to check with that is that they think about an ideal setting, right? So what would you do in an ideal environment, right? You would go and perform interviews. You would have a survey that is performed to the entire population. And very rapidly, my students started to ask me if they could, as this was fictional, they let their imagination go everywhere. And then they were coming up with solutions that were just not feasible in any real world, in the world that is ruled by the laws of physics and the basic like resource constraints that we have, right? And then I thought that my first reaction was like, are you kidding me? Or do you think this is a reasonable approach to the problem? But then I thought more carefully about it, and of course, like, that's also part of one's like fiction, probably fiction, not the right way of framing this, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that, well, once the absence thing is there, anything can be. And then my way of approaching this, so I had to reflect on this, and I told them something like, this is going to be fiction, but it's not going to be sci-fi. So there are not going to be dragons here. You cannot travel in time. So we respect the rules of the world we live in, right? And then with that realm, you can do anything. And all this to ask you, how do you think about what's a relevant conversation when you're thinking about imagination? Why, I suppose, not everything is visible or relevant to consider in that discussion?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I think there are two important things here to consider from my perspective in answering this question. I think one is to recognize the fact that sometimes our imagination can run wild and push beyond the boundaries of sort of like the limits of the physical laws of nature, for example. And the interesting thing about it is that normally when we try to achieve these things in reality, we can get very quickly a reminder about our own limits. And you can think of examples for sort of very overly ambitious goals that whenever someone is trying to actually execute, run into precisely these physical limits in the world. But from my perspective, the more interesting thing is to consider the limits, things that that are viewed as if they are the laws of physics, limits on our actions, that are actually not, that are actually the outcome of human choices and actions. And I think the interesting thing for me is that for so many of our institutions and our norms are often viewed as if they are the laws of physics, right? And when you ask some people about imagining an alternative to capitalism, for example, I think some people think about it as asking to imagine an alternative to gravity. It's just, it goes against the very laws of nature. It's impossible to imagine outside of this thing that we've gotten so used to think about as a necessity. So that's one example for this. And I think the interesting thing about the imagination is that it tells us both why we sometimes view social facts as if they are natural facts, as if they're the laws of physics, That's our imagination that makes us experience these things in a similar way, but it also gives us the ability to challenge and to push them. So our imagination allows us to play around with different alternative ways of life and with different ideas and with different institutions without actually actualizing them. And it allows us to see that some of the things that we take to be natural and necessary are actually the product of human choice and action, and therefore can be changeable.
That's fascinating. Let me try to go deeper into this, and I want to ask you about this paper that you recently published, that it's called Political Phantasies, Aristotle on Imagination and Collective Action, right? And there you focus on this idea of imagination, on Aristotle. And I want to ask you there, probably that I'm trying to think about how to unpack the like many things are there. But why don't we start with a description of what is this wisdom of the multitude, and how is that useful in this larger conversation that you are trying to push forward?
So the wisdom of the multitude is this very important passage from the Politics, Aristotle's famous political treatise, and it's in book 3, passage 11. But every scholar of Aristotle will simply refer to it as 311. And this is a part where Aristotle is asking, well, are there any possible grounds? Are there any possible ways to, or conditions under which a multitude of individuals who are each in themselves not excellent, is not one of the best citizens, the aristoi, in the classical context, could nonetheless, when they come together, when they are combined, can somehow be better collectively than the few excellence, the few of the greater virtue or intelligence or education or wealth or anything like this. And the passage, this wisdom of the multitude passage, gives us some clues or some potential answers for how these things can be possible. And Aristotle is bringing there a couple of different analogies that allows us to think about it. So one of the most famous ones is the potluck analogy, is the idea that somehow when we all bring together different, so basically that a potluck that is composed of multiple contributions, multiple individual contributions, will be somehow superior to a meal that is cooked by one individual. Now, we can question the validity of this argument. I don't know to how many potlucks you've been, but we can certainly question this argument. But the piece of argument that I'm more interested in is with a moment in this passage, in this wisdom of the multitude argument, when Aristotle compares the multitude to a giant person with many heads and many feet and many senses. And the question for me,
very Hobbesian.
It's very Hobbesian, and I also did some work on Hobbes and the imagination in this context, and I think there are some interesting relations to be explored about the contrast and similarities between these positions, and I'm happy to talk more about it. But for Aristotle, the question that motivates me is, well, how is it possible for this giant creature that sounds quite like a monster if you're thinking about it, right? To actually act and behave in a productive way, and actually be able to achieve whatever actions and goals it sets to itself, right? Because you can imagine a world in which each hand and each sense and each part of this body pushes to a different direction. And when you're thinking about how democracy is possible and how collective action is possible, you run into precisely this problem. Well, many people are going to push to different directions. And how are we going to move this thing collectively in one direction? And the approach that I took in this paper to answer this question is the imagination, because I think the imagination is the key to unlocking this monster, this whole weird creature in Aristotle. So the imagination for Aristotle is, as I mentioned earlier, is very similar to this notion that it represents the input of our senses and creates mental representations. But the idea that, well, each of these senses of this creature, of this giant person, is going to introduce new inputs, new sensual inputs about the world. The only way within the Aristotelian framework of imagination that I'm working with, the only way for this creature to be able to work coherently towards some end, some goal, has to be that it should be able to collect all of these conflicting different sensual inputs into a single mental representation, into a single sort of image, if you like, that collects all this input and generating into something that can motivate collective action.
Is this what he calls phantasma?
Yeah, so the imagination, in the Greek word that Aristotle is using for imagination is phantasia, and phantasma is the kind of mental representations that are produced by the imagination. And so the idea there would be that for this giant person to be able to act and move, and it goes to some of Aristotle's theory of animal movement that we don't have to get into, but in order for this giant person to be able to move, it has to have a coherent phantasma that will guide its action.
Full. How do you think about this in a very practical perspective? So I guess what you're describing sounds like a very relevant question for political challenges today, right? Like what, in particular in context of high polarization, that you struggle to consider how the different pieces of the body of the society, and I'm thinking about the US just because we're here, but we can replicate it in a different context. What do you think are those phantasmas or narratives or elements of the imagination that have the potential to not exactly unite us, because it's not about unity, it's about maybe coordination, with a better term for that. And maybe the answer is that there's not one and that we need to generate it spontaneously or something, but how do you think about that from the most practical point of view?
Yeah, I do think that this thing has, this problem has a lot of contemporary and relevant implications. I think that an interesting thing about the imagination is that throughout its history, it was normally conceived as a problem. It was normally seen as posing a challenge. And one of the challenges that the imagination poses is in the fact that the imagination causes different individuals to view the world differently. So the imagination produces these kind of representations of reality. But because of various reasons, each individual imagination will produce not identical representations of reality. It means that different individuals will perceive the world differently because of the... And now the question is, well, how are we going to inhibit actually some kind of a shared world, given the fact that our imagination can often lead us to view the world very differently? And I think today we're seeing this problem in what contemporary work will call belief polarization or deep disagreement or epistemic fragmentation, or this basic concern that we no longer live in the same world. We live in a world of different facts and different realities and different sources of information, which means that two people will look at the same event and will see something very different. Think about the January 6th attack on the Capitol, right? Some people will view it as an action of patriotic citizens who are trying to protect their democracy against what they perceive as attempt to steal the election. Others will view it as the most severe attack on American institutions, on American democratic institutions in centuries. And so I think that the imagination allows us to understand, sort of like in a deep way, some of the epistemological things that are going on behind these moments of deep disagreements and belief polarization. Now, I also think that it gives us a way forward in the sense of, well, if this is the case, if the imagination can lead us into a world where each of us is motivated and operated by how the world seems to them, how the world seems to me, I think that in order to have a functioning democracy, we have to come to share in a certain understanding of how the world seems to us. What do we make of the world, and especially what do we make of the aspects of the world that we make together? How do we come to share in certain agreements? They don't have to be total, they don't have to be absolute, but in certain agreements about our perceptual experiences of the world. How do we come to have this kind of shared framework? And I think that the imagination can give us some way forward with this.
Okay, and I want to use food, and I want to talk much more about this, but I want to use the advantage of the opportunity that you describe this world in which we live in, different universes, and bring the topic of misinformation. It's part of the things you've been thinking about recently, and you've been teaching about this, right? And you have this class. It's called Misinformation and
Democracy, past and present.
Right. And one of the things that I find very interesting about it is that you go through authors. Very Plato itself, but Aristotle thought about it, what's the big takeaway of that course is that, because I had the impression my first reaction when I heard about it was like, okay, maybe this is about the fact that there has been misinformation always, which sounds interesting, I guess, because we relate misinformation a lot with modern technology, so communication, right? So already knowing that sounds interesting, right? But just by the fact that I know that you're very focused on exactly how authors develop their arguments and you focus on text, what are you telling your students to pay attention to? Why is it worth thinking about how Plato thought about misinformation, how Aristotle thought about it?
Yeah, so the motivation for this class was this frustration that I had with a certain take on misinformation in democracy, which is something along the lines of, we had a perfectly functioning democracy and a bunch of rational citizens just rationally deliberating with each other. And then suddenly Facebook came and everything just went downhill from there. And of course, anyone who read some history or history of political thought knows that these problems and these questions are not new. They have a long, long history. And even if, of course, we are dealing with unique challenges today, it doesn't mean that the questions themselves and the problems and the issues themselves are new. And so the question is, well, what can we make of this history, and how can we work with this history when we're struggling with our own problems? Now, of course, I don't think that Plato can give us answers to how to regulate Facebook or how to regulate online speech. He was dealing with his own problems for his own time. But I think that there is something of value for us to learn from the way that he dealt with questions of belief polarization and of lying in politics and of truth in politics and these sort of things. But in order for us to get this value, we have to read Plato on his own term. We cannot try to mine Plato for answers to our own problem, we should situate him within his context and try to understand, to try to unpack how his work responded to real issues and real political problems at his own time. And this is how I encourage my students to approach these texts. I don't want them to exercise that what will Plato say. That's not the exercise that I want them to get. I want them to get is, how might this argument that he's making, how might this question that he's raising correspond to real political problems and concerns that he had for his own time? And what can we learn from the way that he dealt with that question? And what can we learn from it today?
I want to know more about that, because one of the things that I admire profoundly about your work and many of the people in our political theory community is these very detail-oriented, like text-wise research, right? Which is something that I'm not trained in, like that method. And I find fascinating just the fact that you can extract so much insights from a very specific passage. For instance, I find it completely fascinating. And then you just mentioned, when I teach my students, I don't want them to think about the text as how exactly we should interpret Aristotle, like where or the goal is not to have the perfect translation of Aristotle, but instead to infer how he was responding to very specific concerns that he was facing, right? So I guess that my general question there is, how exactly do you help one of your students that probably has the same background that I have, as someone that has read books just for entertainment or something, that the text has a very specific set of knowledge that should be extracted, and what are the specific features of the text that should deserve particular attention. What's your way of dealing with the rest of us that just don't know anything about it?
Yeah, that's a great. Just to clarify to begin with, I do think that they need to pay careful attention to what Aristotle actually said. I do think that they need to read closely passages. The thing that I want to resist is the attempt to engage in this hypothetical exercise of what would Aristotle say about, let's say, Facebook or Trump, because I think that that's not. I don't find it a very helpful question, and I'm not sure that it's an answerable question. But to your question now, I think that we need to, when we read the history of political thought, we sometimes need to retrain ourselves and how we read. Because you're right, we read books all the time, but we read them in a different way and with a different kind of attention. And so I think one of the challenges, especially with undergraduates at a place like Stanford, who are used to reading hundreds of pages for their classes and to skim them very fast and to get to the point, is that when you read the history of political thought, when you read historical texts, especially for the Greeks, it's sometimes they don't always conform to the same standards that we expect from contemporary writings. So it's going to be a lot harder to get to the point with someone like Plato, which means that your reading of Plato would have to be done with more care and a lot with slower pace and with a lot more attention to details. Now, the question of the level of attention to details depending on what it is that you're looking for, because for certain questions and for certain puzzles in the text, what you really need to do is to sit with the Greek text and read it very carefully and very, very slowly. And the advantage of reading the Greek text is that it forces you to read a lot slower than you would for an English translation or any other translation. That's not something I expect my undergraduate students to do, but I do at the very least hope that they will engage with these authors in a charitable way as much as possible, and try to understand them on their own terms, rather than forcing back on them our expectations and our conceptions and our problems. I encourage them to do the very best, to read them carefully, and to read them charitably, and to try to understand them on their own term, in their own contexts, and given their own problems and questions that they had in mind.
Now I want to, I guess, probably continue with this theme because you're translating Plato now, and that's you're facing there probably the same type of challenges that you're pushing your students to do, but probably for a very specific purpose that it is as general as you can imagine, which is to be as faithful, I guess, to purpose of Plato. And I want to ask you then, how do you do that? Like, how do you think about what's the right way of capturing what the author was there? And I guess probably an advantage with authors like Plato is that there are a bunch of other people that have done similar exercises for different languages. And I guess you're going to tell me exactly what you're translating, and maybe you can support on them. But still, and I'm sorry if these are very basic questions, but like I still find it a bit quite mind blowing to this whole effort of interpreting the thought of someone and just deciding what's the right not only tone but meaning of things and so on. Like, what's your approach to that endeavor?
Yeah, I started translating Plato during COVID, actually, when I was looking for a way of practicing my Greek in the absence of the normal Greek classes here at Stanford that I took. And I decided to do it because I remember the experience of reading Plato in Hebrew as quite a frustrating experience. And one of the reasons is that we have a really impressive translation project by one guy in the 50s in Israel who translated the entire work of Plato. But that's the only translation that we have. And the problem is that Hebrew evolved a lot in the past 7 decades, and it makes it very inaccessible to students. The old the old archaic translation. So I remember teaching Plato in Hebrew, and I just seeing students were struggling with the text, and I think now in retrospect that maybe 50% of their struggle came from the translation and not from the actual argument and ideas. And so I think that's the reason why I was why I was motivated to do this in the first place. Now, I think that every translation is an act of interpretation, and with an author like Plato, it's especially present and complicated, because every sentence in Plato, that's at least my sense, my wonder every time that I read him. Every sentence in Plato has at least four different layers of meaning that you can work with, and it really depends on how deep you want to dive. It makes translating a single sentence not just only hard, but also it makes it into a choice. Now, when you read a translation, you don't necessarily read what Plato actually meant. You read someone's interpretive decision about what they think that Plato meant in a specific sentence. And so it's an immense responsibility as a translator. And so my approach is both to be as informed as I can by the immense literature on Plato and by other translators, of course, in different languages. So I will work with the German translation and Italian translation and the English translation, but also to the very enormous literature on these things that would allow me, in moments where I'm not quite sure what is the meaning of this sentence, what is the meaning of this word, that will allow me to dive in and to see what other people have said about it. So that is my main. So I'm trying as much as I can to be to be informed by this scholarship, and I'm also trying to be transparent about my choices. And so I got 40% through the Republic, and when I'm done, I hope to add a pretty lengthy interpretive essay to this translation and a lot of long, detailed notes detailing some of my translation choices, and maybe in pointing the reader who is willing to take the extra step to alternative translations and to some complications with certain words. But that will be the footnote, not in the main text, of course.
That's crazy. I mean, I have to tell you, probably the first time that I don't know, the first time that I saw you, that I met you, you were mentioning this on a dinner we're attending together. And I remember thinking how amazing it was, just the fact that Saul was pursuing that endeavor. When I talk to you, it happens the same thing that when I talk to Charles Schroeder, that I just feel, I need to learn more about the ancient Greek world, and it's something that I find fascinating. So thanks a lot. I really enjoy our chat. I hope that we have a bunch of other things we should get together again to talk more about. But you're very generous. I'm very happy with our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Javier. I had a wonderful time.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Civic Agora, brought to you by the Stanford Civics Initiative. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify, where you can discover more podcast episodes and gain access to additional information about the Stanford Civics Initiative. I'm your host, Javier Mejia. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged. Thank you and take care.